start recording, and I'll also start recording here. Great. Okay, so PGW, procedural geometry and workflows. We will be using primarily Houdini for this class. Don't worry about it. We'll cover it, slowly, one topic at a time. But with regards to the subject, right, we're going to primarily cover procedural geometry. So you're familiar with creating geometry. You know how to model stuff. So basically, extruding polygons, faces, vertices, and all of that stuff. But we're going to look at other ways to generate geometry, primarily using procedural methods or automatic methods. So we'll have a look at those techniques. We'll also explore simulations. So simulations and effects like, water, smoke, particles, and all of that stuff. So you don't keyframe those things. You animate them in a more procedural manner. So we'll explore that particular technique. Abstraction and generative art, meaning you're working with a computer and with the software to generate new forms and functionalities and new, I guess, ways of expressing or visualizing certain objects. So a really divergent way of creating 3D geometry or 3D imagery. So we'll have a look at all those things, okay? I guess just a quick check. As I mentioned, we are using Houdini for this particular class. Just checking if you guys are familiar with Houdini. Anyone here who've used Houdini before? I think I have some of you in previous classes, but just checking if so. Keith, Jake, and we have Isabel. So we might have a couple or a few. Okay, that's good. So we will have a look at okay, great. No worries. With regards to Houdini, though, I sent you guys through your student emails, right? So through your student emails, I sent you guys. So it's coming from Side Effects. So if you don't see it, it might be in your junk mail or spam mail, but it's going to be from Side Effects. And again, it's a link for your, free Houdini software, right? It's an educational license. Okay, so just take note of that. So anyway, just some examples of stuff where you see proceduralism. So you see this a lot in things like almost anywhere really. So things like this, right? So it's not really any specific or any method of keyframe animation that you're able to generate those types of forms. So you don't want to model that. So those are things that you actually generate in a more procedural manner, right? So this is where Houdini comes in really handy. It's really good at those types of effects and those types of geometry simulation. So see, doing that manually, guys, or keyframe or modeling it will probably take you forever. But again, with Houdini, it's really good at these types of effects. Okay, and maybe a few more examples. Not I haven't seen some of them, but you'll see this a lot in this type of in installations, film, visual effects, and all of that stuff. Okay, so oftentimes you use something like Houdini to generate those types of effects. Okay, and I'll show you more examples as we move along. So again, you have an idea of what proceduralism is and where you can find it. Again, I'll give you more examples as we move along. Maybe I haven't seen this one, so let's have a look at that. So stuff like that, right? So again, really divergent ways of creating effects and geometry. Okay. Now, with regards to the assessments, though, you'll be creating 3 different types of visualization. So basically 3 sequences. So we'll start with a simple sequence first in assessment 1, and then we'll have a look at the more intermediate, advanced visualization for assessment 2, and then an even more advanced one is in assessment 3. So you don't even have to worry about it for now. Okay, just concentrate on the first assessment. Okay, and that first assessment is really a simple visualization. So what art are you visualizing for your first assessment? I already sent you guys a scope sheet for what you're completing. If you don't have it yet, have a look at the announcements because I did send it there. But basically, you're recreating or you're reinterpreting some of the kinetic sculptures this artist has done over the years. So he's a very popular kinetic sculptor. So he does very popular artist. He's done a lot of kinetic sculpture. So I'll show you some of the examples here. So this is Refik, Anadul. So some of that stuff, right? Now we're not doing simulations for that, but these are just examples of some of his work. Okay. Now, I'm not going to specify which one you want to reinterpret. Just choose, I guess, you get an idea of his style, right? You get an idea of the type of visualization he likes to do. So I want you to create an interpretation of that particular, I guess, idea. Okay. So some examples here. So perhaps I'll play that. So it's really those generative forms, those procedural, geometries similar to what you see here. Okay, I'll show you a few more examples with regards to this. So, for example, something like this. See, so I like that. So changing colors and then changing, using patterns and noise to generate different types of forms and different types of geometry. And then you can have a look at that, on your own time. But I'm just showing you some examples there. So I like this, for example. So it's like a series of boxes, and then it's moving in a really organic way, and it changes color with time as well. So some really interesting movements there. Okay, so you're creating some interpretations for that. Now, these are some of the work that's done by previous students. Although they were working on a different brief, but just some examples of some of the stuff they've done, right? So some of the stuff they've done here. There you go. So some really good stuff as well. Let's see if this one is. There you go. There's audio there as well. I'm not sure if you guys can hear, but some examples, right? Again, they were working on a different brief, but you guys will be, again, inspired. So what I want you guys to do, that's right. It's pretty good. Okay, that's right. So what I want you guys to do is be inspired by the work of Refik Anadul. Not necessarily copy it, but just be inspired with it. Inspired about the topics that he visualizes, like machine hallucinations. He visualizes, emotions and different type of, AI stuff, right? So think about that. What I like doing is perhaps going to Bing Image Creator, for example. So, or any AI tool, and you can just have a look at some examples. So just an example here. So you can just type that in. See, so I like that. I like those examples. Again, just for inspirational purposes, right? I like seeing some of those as a way to inspire what potentially I will do. Okay. Okay. So it's assessment one clear for everyone. Just checking. So just checking with everyone here if that's clear from Ariel all the way to Zachary. Just checking if that's clear for you guys in terms of what you need to do. So you're not really, I'm saying recreating, but it's really reimagining, right? So based off the themes that Refek Anadul delves into, create your own visualization based off that particular, idea. That's right. So a bit broad, but it's really a lot of the stuff we're doing is experimentation. So it's you using the techniques and tools and coming up with your own. Okay. When I say your own, again, ideally it's inspired, right? So if I look at it, you know what, this work is definitely inspired by Refik Anadol. Okay, so something like that. So what I don't want is a situation where, you know, you can just say that a piece of sphere or maybe three spheres here might symbolize light in you know, in a negative space, and they're just moving up and down. So technically it's still artwork, but it's not really the visualization we're looking for. Okay, and then this becomes really clear as we cover a bit more stuff with regards to you know, proceduralism. Okay, so again, a really important thing with regards to the assessment, guys, and we'll talk about this later on. We do have weekly challenges. Okay, so every week I'm going to issue a challenge that you guys need to, well, that you guys want to complete, right? And it's going to be worth up to 10 assessment points. So I already gave you guys the challenge for this week, and this is going to be due. In fact, let me just type that in. This is going to be due Wednesday. September. So what's Wednesday? September 27. Okay, there you go. Okay, so I want you to recreate this very simple sequence. Okay, so it's really just, you know, ideally with the same colors, but you can change the colors. But the idea behind that is, see, it's appears from the middle, going outwards, and then you have a series of boxes changing, you know, extrusion, basically changing scales or changing extrusions. Lots of ways you can do this, but again, that's what I want you guys to do, and then render it out, right? So again, an important aspect of that is that's again our weekly challenges. Every week I'm going to issue a weekly challenge. It can be worth up to 10 points. Every assessment is 100 points, right? So what you can do is with the challenges you can earn up to 30 to 40 points in an assess in you know, in 4 weeks towards your first assessment, and that really helps you with your actual project itself. So just take note of that. I'm going to issue it during class time, so make sure. I might add additional points to people who are able to do it first. So maybe the first 10 of you who do it get the full 10 points. Okay. The challenges are actually a replacement for, so almost all 3D subjects will have an aspect of creating a production blog. Now, instead of you guys doing a production blog, I'm going to ask you to just do the challenges rather than create a blog. So this is in, it's not an addition, it's actually a requirement. So um, instead of doing a production blog, we're just doing this. So which acts as your production blog. Okay. So the purpose for the production blog, or you know, or documenting your work, is so we can see the progress every week. But rather than doing that, we'll just do this because it does exactly the same thing for me. Okay. So we'll just do this in instead of a production blog. Okay. All good. So those are good questions. So any questions before we continue? So you guys know what to do. I already mentioned what you're trying to recreate. So worst case scenario, right? If you're not really sure what you want to do, okay, then try mimicking, let's say, this one. So if exploring, creative exploration is difficult for you, then maybe just look for an image. Look at let's say an existing visualization, or some you know, some sequences inspired by Refik or created by Refik, and then try recreating parts of it or aspects of it, and that will be, I guess, uh, that's suitable for what you're doing for assessment one. Now, if you want to take it a step further, where you want to integrate your own creative input and then your own interpretation of that particular sculpture, then yes, then that's even better, right? So worst case scenario, if you're not really sure what to do, then just choose one and try to recreate that. Okay, and then and that's it. And as I mentioned, a really important thing are the weekly activities. So I do recommend that everyone have a look at the Discord channel, because I do issue, you know, our weekly challenges there. It's going to be worth up to 10 points. So no need creating a blog. Although some of you might prefer creating a blog, so my recommendation, or I strongly recommend that you just do this one instead of maintaining a blog. So question from Danny, where do you want to submit? You submit it in Discord. Okay, so here. So basically, under week 1 challenge, just submit it directly there. So if you have a submission, just put your name will be there anyway. It's going to be obvious when it is. That's right. Okay. So rather than doing a blog, and again, I much rather have you guys do this. Okay. So just do that. I'll issue a challenge, try to recreate that, or try to do the challenge, and that's it. Okay. Great. Okay. So no other questions. Let's have a look at, let's start talking about Houdini now then. Okay. So just a few things, guys. Okay. Anyone here who doesn't have Houdini yet in their computers? So just checking if you haven't received any Houdini license yet. Again, I sent it already. If not, just message me in Discord or in Blackboard, either way. But maybe here, I'll just put this here. PGW. That's right. So as long as um, for some of you who might have issues with installing licenses, especially when you're using a Mac, because licensing in Mac is tricky, just contact me, or you might need to contact side effect support as well. Because again, if you are using a Mac, it's a bit tricky with a Mac for some reason. So we have a lot of issues there. But again, side effect support usually contacts you immediately, like a day or so. So if you message them soon, then you will be able to, you know, should be able to install that. Okay, so just a quick note. Okay, so just a few things, guys. Okay, so I already have Houdini here. Now we're going to cover just 3 things. Okay, 3 simple things for today. Number 1 is this idea of attribute manipulation. Okay, in fact, let me just modify this. So we're really just covering 3 things, right? So I'll just skip that one. So the things we'll cover, and let me just change this. There you go. So just 3 things, because I put everything here, but it's really just attribute manipulation, grouping, and rendering your stuff out in Houdini. So just those 3 things. Okay. So if you know those 3 things, you will be able to do the challenge and even start doing some of the exploration needed for your assessment. Okay. So let's just have a look at those few things first. So let's have a look at attribute manipulation first. Okay. So I'm currently opening Houdini. Okay, so this is Houdini, and this is probably what you'll end up seeing in your computers there. Let me just change this so it's exactly similar to what you guys have. So it's probably going to look something like this, right? Save as default. Okay, there you go. Okay, so it's probably going to look something like this, guys. Okay, if it doesn't look anything like this, just change it to build. So again, if it doesn't look like this, just change it to build or modeling. It should give you this particular display. Okay. So with that, important thing with regards to any 3D software is that most of them, if not all of them, work on a project structure, meaning you have to specify that you're working on a project. This allows the software to create directories that are suitable for whatever project you're doing. Okay, so similar to Maya, you create a Maya project folder. In Houdini, you also create a Houdini project folder. So before talking about anything, let's just create a Houdini project folder. So you, again, before you do anything, right, you either create a new project or set an existing one. So what I'll do is I'll go File, New Project, and I'll just create a new project. I'll specify where it is. I'll put it in somewhere in my computer. My recommendation, guys, don't put it in your desktop. Okay, put it in inside, let's say, an actual sorry, an actual drive or location. Don't put it in your desktop. Sometimes it has issues if you set it to your desktop. So basically what I'm saying is, see, I'll put it in a folder, maybe in my D drive, and then I'll put it in the Houdini projects. I'll hit accept, and then I'll just put their test. Okay, so there you go. Hit accept. So the moment you do that, it creates appropriate folders. Sorry, guys. So just to show you, right? So there you go. Okay, so I created the folder. It created that test project, and then it also created those sub directories. Okay. Sorry, let me just grab some water. Okay, sorry guys, just battling some bug. Anyway, so it creates an automatic folder for you, right? And this is important. So again, just make sure you create a project or you set a project. But let's have a look at the first thing, okay? Attribute manipulation, okay? So what I'll do is I'm going to create a simple geometry. So perhaps I'll just go. Now, with regards to Houdini, the interface is easily customizable. And what I like doing, guys, is I like just turning this off. Sorry. This one. Uh, the reason for that is this allows me to view the object network in a very big screen rather than have it in a very small window. So I prefer doing that. So that's why I have something like this usually when I'm working inside Houdini. So I have this build, and then basically I just have this object network box, and I have my perspective view here. And let me just change my perspective view. Okay, there you go. Okay, so I'm going to create a very simple piece of geometry, right? Now, notice that we do have create here. So I'll just create a really simple sphere, for example. So I'll click on the sphere, and then I'll just press enter, and it creates it in the 0, 0 world space. Okay. So what happens is, guys, it's a bit weird compared to other softwares because now you're getting the geometry in your network view or your object level. So notice that in the object level, you have that sphere, and then you have your sphere here. So yes, you can move it, you can rotate it, and you can scale it, but I don't even recommend you do that, okay? What I do want you guys to have a look at is inside that object level, you're able to access the geometry of that object. So this allows you to access and manipulate things like um, transformation. So let me just change it again. There you go. So this allows you to modify things like translation, rotate, and scale. So again, notice that if you just press P, right? P for properties, it allows you to access the properties of that particular object, especially if you close the properties window. But what I want you guys to do is have a look at what's inside the geometry. If you look at inside the geometry, notice that you can access the geometry level of that object. Okay, so again, notice that it's a bit like a hierarchy view. You're viewing the geometry level, But if you go to the object level, you're viewing the transformation of that object, meaning translation, rotate, and scale. But going inside that object, notice, guys, that you have the geometry level. And in the geometry level, you can access things like uniform scale, you can modify the number of rows, and you can modify the number of columns. Now, similar to, let's say, you create something else, let's say a grid. Okay, so when you create a grid, notice that we have this grid view, and I just deleted it by selecting the object and pressing delete. But that's your grid view. Okay, now again, this is geometry level. Okay, so at object level, sorry, notice that we're seeing the translation, rotate, and scale. But if you double click and go inside that object, notice now we're in now geometry level. And in the geometry level, we can modify things like rows, columns, and we can add additional nodes to it. Okay, in fact, we can even change this to, let's say, mesh or maybe NURBS and all of that stuff. Okay, so again, it's almost like a hierarchy view where you create an object, and again, like that sphere, and then we're currently in object level, but if you go inside it, we're now in geometry level. Now, the reason why this is important, guys, is if you have a look at geometry level, right? Notice that there's a couple of things there. If you middle mouse click, okay, notice that your geometry or whatever object you create there, it will have points, okay? It will have primitives, it will have vertices, it will have polygons, for example. So what does this mean? These are the components of your object, okay? So it has points as components, primitives is basically faces, and vertices is similar to points, but a bit more, I guess. The thing with vertices is it's not really traditional poly vertices. For now, just concentrate on points, just concentrate on primitives, okay? So again, if you middle mouse click on that object, notice that you are seeing the points, you are seeing the primitives there. So this object has 266 points and it has 288 faces. In fact, if you go to the geometry spreadsheet of that object, you can actually see that each of those points, so we're currently looking at points, each point has a position X value, a position Y value, a position Z value. So that's position X, that's position Y, and position Z. Now, if you don't believe me, have a look at your scene view. Notice that I can activate or I can display the point numbers by just clicking on this button here. And notice what happens there, right? So we have 0.0 here. Okay, so you can actually see 0.0. To select 0.0, I'll just change my geometry selection to points, and I'll just select that. Okay, so notice that 0.0, guys, as I mentioned, I'll just look for that. 0.0, there you go. So we selected 0.0. It's roughly around -2 in X. So world position, -2. Y position is 0.5. Then Z position is -5. Okay. So what these are is these are the attributes of those points. So the position attributes of those points, notice that it's -2, 0.5 in Y, and -5 in Z. Let me just expand this a bit further. Okay, so let's just do it one more time. This time I'll just create a grid. Okay, so for that grid, similar stuff. I'll go inside the object. So you could really see the grid. Let me just change my display to wireframe. Again, you don't have to. I'm just showing you guys that. But again, this is geometry level, right? So with geometry level, you can access things like the translation, rotation, and scale. Object level. But if you go inside that, we're now in geometry level. And in geometry level, if you middle mouse click, you can now access points, primitives, vertices, and polygons. In fact, I just turned on the points display so I can see what those individual points are. Okay, so notice that we have 0.0. If you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet, notice that 0.0, it has attributes of -5 in X, 0 in Y, and -5 in Z, meaning that's its position in world space. So it's -5, what was it? It was -5, 0, and then -5 in Z. Okay, so for example, maybe one last example here, maybe this point, 0.47. Okay, so what if you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet, notice that that point 47, it has attributes. So at position X, it's 2, position Y, it's 0, and then position Z, it's negative 0.5, roughly, anyway. So why is this important? This is important because Houdini can modify those attributes, okay? So let me just show you what I mean by that, okay? I'm going to create, and I'll just start again. I'm going to create a grid, okay? And again, this is our grid, and I'll go inside that grid, guys. Okay, we're now in geometry level. I'll hide the points so you won't get confused, but that's our grid there. Okay, and maybe, you know what, I'll just turn off the actual orthographic grid there so you won't get confused. But that's our object, guys. Okay, I'm going to increase the number of rows. Again, I'm currently in geometry level. I'm going to increase the number of rows. Maybe 30 and 30. Or you know what? Let's go all the way to 80 and 80. I can also change the size. Maybe I'll change it to, let's say, I don't know, 2 and 2. Doesn't really matter, right? The important thing is I'm just modifying all those parameters, okay? So what I'll do now is I'll have a look at the geometry spreadsheet. Notice that we now have all the points there. They have position values. So what do I mean with Houdini being able to modify those positional values? What I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to add a node after this grid. Okay, so basically what we have is a grid. So that's our starting point. I want to add something on top of that. I want to modify the grid. So what I'll do is I'll press tab. So again, tab. Tab allows us to modify or add a modifier or add another node on top of the grid. So what happens is I'll add tab and I'll look for a special node called mountain node. Now, it's really impractical for us to discuss every single one of them. The best way to do this is to just follow some of the most important nodes that we're going to cover. One node that's important is going to be the mountain node. I'll show you why, okay? So if I click on mountain node, I'll plug it in there, okay? Now notice that we have the grid and we have the mountain node. It's not connected at this stage yet. So what I'll do is I'm going to connect them. I'm going to connect the grid to the mountain node here, okay? Now we're not really displaying anything. So we don't see anything. We don't see any changes. And the reason for that is we haven't activated the mountain node yet. We're viewing the grid. If you want to view what happens after we plugged in the mountain node, I need to click on this. Okay? And notice what happens, guys. Let me just turn off, I guess, go back to primitives here. Okay? So notice what happens. I added a mountain node and it modified our grid. Okay? Just to prove my point, if I go back to the grid, see, so I made this visible. Notice that the grid, if you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet, it really has different values in X, Y, and Z. But if you have a look at Y, it's primarily 0 for all of them because it's flat. But notice what happens when we added the mountain node. The mountain node modified those positional values. See? Notice that point 0, instead of having 0 in Y, it has different values now. In fact, it has different values in X, Y, and Z. Okay, so if you have a look at, again, the original one, notice that it didn't change it in X and Y and Z, but it did change it in Y. See, notice that you can actually see the changes there. Okay, so now what happens is we have this effect now where we have our object deformed. Okay, so what essentially the mountain node is doing, it's just modifying the attributes of the grid, primarily the position attributes of those individual points. Okay, so again, a bit tricky with regards to Houdini. To actually view something, you have to make sure that it's activated so you can see what's happening there. Okay, now does this make sense for everyone? What we're essentially doing here. So what we're doing, guys, is again, we know attributes. So the points that we in our grid have positional attributes. And what Houdini allows us to do is it allows us to modify those attributes by adding things like points, okay, or things like nodes like this, the mountain node. And what this does, it allows us to modify the position of those individual points, primarily in Y. And now we get a totally different look. Okay, so does that make sense, or any questions with regards to that particular idea? Because that's quite important, right? That idea of attribute manipulation is going to be quite important moving forward. So just checking with Ariel all the way to Blake, Danny, Isabel, Jake, Jared, Keith, Olivia, Prasan, Samuel, Dick, Samuel, and then Zachary. Makes sense? So what we're doing really is we're going to modify. That's right. So we're just modifying the position of the objects, right? So let's have a look at that particular scenario, guys. Okay. So maybe I'll do this again. You know what? Let's just stick with the grid. So with that mountain node, notice that if you go and press P, you can actually modify the properties of that mountain node. Okay. So if you have a look at there, guys, notice that it's really modifying position. So see, it's modifying the position. P is basically the attribute position, right? It's a vector, meaning it's X, Y, and Z. It has 3 values. So what this essentially is doing, it's actually just a noise you're adding onto the position of the points that allows that allows you to deform that object. Okay, so now we have that mountain node. Okay, and notice that the operation is just adding on top of the values. So basically, if it's 0, it's just adding values on top of, let's say, position Y. So that's why you're seeing those values there. And then notice that we have things like amplitude. So we can increase the amplitude of that. And then this is the noise type. Okay, so notice that we can increase or decrease that noise type. We can even change the noise type. But what I like doing, guys, is I like changing the fractal first. Because oftentimes you get low frequency noises when you use this particular node. I'll just turn it off. I'll set it to none. Okay, so notice what happens. I'll set that fractal to none so I can just see what happens with the noise itself, the bass noise itself. So notice that I have amplitude. And then I can modify the element size. Okay, so there you go. So I can just modify that, make it smaller. And then maybe you can increase that or you can decrease that. Okay. In fact, guys, you can even change the element size. It's doing it in X, Y, and Z. But we can actually specify that, let's say, in X by clicking on this button. I can, for example, change this to, let's say, 2 in X. Or maybe 0.3. I can use middle mouse button drag. So see, I can do that. Sorry. I can do that. Y doesn't really do anything, but Z allows you to do that as well. Okay. So we can modify that as a whole, or perhaps individually in X, Y, and Z. So there you go, guys. Now, one interesting thing though is you do have animate noise. So if you activate that, notice what happens. If you hit play, it allows you to animate the noise. In Houdini though, it's going to be extremely fast because it's going to play it 1 frame at a time at a non-specified frame rate. So what you might want to do is just activate that real-time toggle. So if you activate that, notice what happens if you hit play. I have that. Okay. So notice that that actually takes a long time to do if you're doing it in Maya, but notice how easy it is to do if you use something like Houdini. So what is this doing, guys? The mountain node, if you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet, it's just modifying the position Y of the points, right? So it's basically, the reason why it's positioning position Y, it's basically using the normal, it's not really position Y, but everything is pointing up. So that's why the noise is modifying the points base where it's pointing. It's pointing up in the Y-axis. That's why it's modifying just the Y-axis. Okay, so now you're seeing something like that. So there you go. Now you can change the pulse duration, and you can also change, make it slower, or make it faster. Okay, depending on what you want to do here. Now, on top of that, you have other tools here that you could do. So that includes things like warping, things like, for example, I can change the gradient warp. And again, this is where exploration will come in, where you just play around with the values and just see what that does. Okay, so notice that I can just play around with it and just see what it does. So what I like doing is maybe instead of simplex, let's have a look at the whirly cellular type and let's see what that actually looks like. Okay, so if I hit play, I have something like that now. If maybe I'll just increase, there you go. Okay, the element size, and now I have, I guess, something like that. Guys, it's currently adding, but what if I'm subtracting it? Notice now that I get something totally different. Okay, so I have something like this. Or maybe instead of Whirly, maybe let's try Manhattan Cellular. And I have something like that. And maybe I can play around with amplitude. Or perhaps play around with element size. Or maybe play around with the individual element sizes here. So maybe something like that. Okay? Or maybe, you know what, I'll try a different one. Maybe I'll try Perlin Flow, and I get something totally different as well. And maybe I'll just do it here. Okay, there you go. Okay. So question from Mikael, yes, that's right. So you can definitely use audio. A bit tricky to do, but you can definitely use audio for that as well. And we might cover that, you know, later on in the process. Anyway, so that's the idea behind it, right? You are able to add that in. Now, the thing is, guys, this is totally procedural in nature. So what do I mean by procedural? It's non-destructive, meaning, guys, I can replace that grid. So instead of using the grid, I'll press tab. Again, we're in geometry level. And I'll look for sphere, okay? So I have a sphere there. And maybe for this sphere, I'll just display that. Again, if it's not blue, it's not displayed. So I need to make sure it's displayed so I can see it, right? So again, guys, see, if you're viewing the grid, see, now you ask me, where's the mountain? The reason you're not seeing the mountain node or the noise is because you're not viewing it. So to actually view it, have a look at that, and there you go, right? There's your actual, you know, mountain deformation there. Now, just to show you that it's non-destructive, right? I have my sphere here. I'm displaying the sphere. I'm just changing it to, let's say, polygons. And I'll just increase the number of points there by just increasing the frequency to, let's say, 50. And notice what happens, guys. I'll replace that grid with the sphere, and then I'll activate the mountain node. And notice what happens there. I have something totally different. So I don't have to change anything. We're just putting... Okay, so question from Samuel. For this one, see, you can just activate this button, turn that on and off, and then you should be able to activate. Now, not all noises do that. You might need to stop the playback first. Try using a different noise. If you're using a fast noise, I don't think, or maybe a simplex one, it might not have it. So you just have to choose a different noise. If that doesn't work, just delete the mountain node, and then recreate, and then just create a new mountain node on top of that. Okay, so there you go. So see, guys, notice what happens there. I have a totally different looking object there. So again, see, I can use the grid or I can use the sphere. Okay, so now we have, so maybe I might lower down the element size, and I have a totally different looking object there. Okay, so now I have something like that. So again, what this essentially is doing, guys, okay, have a look at your geometry spreadsheet, right? Notice that for this sphere, okay, this sphere, notice that, see, we have different attributes for the position. And what this mountain node is doing is it's just modifying those attributes, right? Modifying the position of those attributes. So if I hit play, notice what happens there. I'm viewing the mountain node. It's animated because the mountain node is animated. The noise is animated. That's why the position of those individual points in your sphere also changes because, again, it's manipulating the attributes. Okay? Now, does that make sense for everyone at this stage? So, do you understand now why the sphere deforms and what it's deforming? It's deforming the position, right? So it's not necessarily just, it's not just deforming an object. You have to understand that the reason why it's deforming is because the mountain node is actually modifying and changing the object, the attributes themselves. In this particular instance, the position attributes. Okay, great. So understanding that, that's good. But let's just take this a step further, guys. Okay, let's go back to our grid. Okay, again, don't be confused because again, if you have a look at our object, we have a grid there, but I can just call that object. It doesn't really matter what's, this is just, you know, your transformation. This is just your object level, but your object level can have any geometry that you want. So see, I can have the sphere there, and I have the grid there. But basically, we're in geometry level, right? We can merge things together, but we'll cover that later on the process. So let's have a look at another one. If you middle mouse click, guys, notice that we do have position, right? So it's the only attribute you think that we're able to modify, but it's not, okay? You can easily create attributes, or you can access attributes that Houdini understands. So just an example, an attribute Houdini understands is color. So that's point color, meaning every single point can have its own color. And you can access this by the attribute called CD. Okay, so just to prove my point, I'll just use a special node. So under attributes, there's something there called, you know what? Let me just press tab and let's look for color. Attribute adjust color, this one. So again, we're looking for attribute adjust color. Attribute adjust color. So, or I can just press tab. So again, this allows us to access or locate that particular node. So it's called attribute adjust color. Guys, again, for this one, it's like a flowchart, meaning you start with your base idea first, and then you connect it to the next thing you want to do to it. So basically, I start with the grid, and after the grid, I want to modify the color. Okay? So notice what happens. We have attribute adjust color. Notice what happens if you middle mouse click on the attribute adjust color, guys. See? Earlier, we only had position. Now, we have CD, or color. Let me just grab a few things. Sorry about the coughing is annoying, but again, we do have CD, right? So what's happening is if you middle mouse click, we now have CD, and CD is something you can manipulate. Okay, so just to prove my point, currently the CD is a consistent color. Let me just change it to red, and notice what happens. If you have a look at our CD in a geometry spreadsheet, every single point you have, okay, so again, every single point you have will have a CD attribute. The CD attribute is a vector, meaning it's red, green, and blue. So assigning it a red color basically just tells Houdini, you know what, for the component red, make sure it's fully 1. Okay, it doesn't have any green component or blue component, so that's why it's 0, because it's pure red. But let's say if it's pure green, notice what happens. It's 0 in red, 0 in blue. What if it's pure blue? It's 0 in red, 0 in green, but then 1 in blue. Or maybe somewhere in between. Let's say this one. So maybe, you know what, this one. So see, it's 0.5 in red, 1 in green, and maybe 1 in blue. In fact, if I just modify this, see guys, it can have any value that you want really. So see, it's now 0.9 in red, 0.4 in green, and 1 in blue. Okay? And that's only because we just specified the pattern that's constant, meaning we just add a constant color. Again, really important thing for anyone who's just new to Houdini. So you added the color, but for example, you did this. So you look at it and say, I added the color, but it's not giving me the correct color. The reason for that is you have to make sure that whatever you added is also visible. So I'll make that visible by turning on the visibility flag. So it's basically the visibility flag. So again, guys, the reason why this is cool, because again, it's constant, right? You only get one color. Try changing that. Let's try noise. Okay? And notice what happens. Now we added a noise value to the color. Now, if you have a look, it's using simplex noise and it's using the position. So basically the idea is it's adding a noise color, or basically noise based off this ramp. It's plugging it into your points and it's using the position. So how does it know where to add red? How does it know where to add blue or green? It's using the position of those individual points. So basically based off their position, I'm assigning it a color, green, red, or blue. In fact, this is the color ramp it's using. Okay. Now notice that you have element size. You can make it smaller. And you can again animate that if you want. Okay, so if I hit play, notice now that I have that particular animation. Guys, this is totally dependent on the number of points you have. In fact, if you just have, let's say, a few points. So if you only have 6 points, see, I only have 36 points. Notice that it doesn't give you anything, nice to look at, right? But if you increase the number of rows to, let's say, I don't know, 120 and 120, notice that it's much more visible now, right? Because again, the attributes are on either on a point basis or a face basis. Okay, this time it's points. How do I know it's points? I know it's points because if you middle mouse click, see, it's position. It's point attributes, guys. So we're assigning it on point attributes. Okay. Now, again, we simply manipulated that. Again, impractical for me to explain every single one of these parameters. So what I like doing is I like turning off fractal so I can just see it as is. And then you can play around with warping. So maybe I can warp it like that. And then maybe gradient warp. And then maybe I'll just make it faster. And then I'll hit play. Okay, so now I have, I guess, something like that. Again, making sure that you activate the real-time toggle here. Okay, so again, I won't have enough time to cover every single one of them. It's really up to you to explore. This is where exploration comes in, okay? Because again, when you're trying to recreate something or you're trying to visualize something, it's a lot of experimentation there. So maybe I'll try whirly cellular. Oh, you know what? That actually looks okay. And I'll try playing around with it, okay? Now, let me just explain that again, it's not necessarily just points that you're able to assign the color into, right? So currently it's assigning color on the points, but you can actually change that to primitives, okay? And let me just show you what that looks like. To see it, I'll just lower down the number of points or faces there. So what's happening is, guys, I'm just lowering the number of faces. If you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet for this, notice now, or sorry, our scene view, if I middle mouse drag, see, instead of having point attributes, we now have primitive attributes. And the reason why we have primitive attributes is because I specified it to be primitive, meaning I want Houdini to add a CD attribute, but put that in the primitives or the faces rather than the points. That's why I have something like this now. Okay, so if I hit play, I get something like that. Okay, now obviously, this is totally... So what if you want to combine both? Okay, what if you want to combine the CD and the mountain? So it's really just adding another mountain node, either before or after. In fact, let me just do after. Okay, I'll add the mountain node, and maybe for this mountain node, I'll make that Perlin flow, and then animation, animate noise, and then maybe I'll change that, increase the amplitude a little bit, and then let's see what that looks like. If I hit play, I get something like that. Okay. So what's happening is this node is modifying the CD on a primitive basis, but this node is modifying the position on a point basis. Okay, so if you think about it from a logical perspective, we started with a sphere, with a grid, and with that grid, now sometimes this happens where you see both of them. This is where labs will come in. So make sure to install labs. We'll cover this later on because you have a reset viewport that's really important sometimes. So see, so we started off with a grid. We modified the color and then we added a mountain node on top of that. So if I hit play, I get something like this. So does this make sense for everyone for now? Any questions? Can I check if that's clear for Zachary, Samuel, Prasan, Olivia, Keith, Jared, Jake, Isabel, Danny, Blake, and Ariel? So far so good. Great. So what we're essentially doing, right, is we're just modifying attributes. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully in a good way, because there's a lot of things you can do, playing around with different values, right? So it's a different way of approaching 3D, really. So again, guys, see, very logical in terms of what it's doing. Okay, so let me just so let's just take this a step further, guys. Okay, take this step further. Okay, so it's basically attribute manipulation. Okay, and that's the power of Houdini. Other softwares, is for example Maya, you can't really do that. But in Houdini, you're able to manipulate attributes. So let me just show you what attributes you're able to modify. Alpha, okay? And I'll just show you what this does. Alpha is basically, it's almost like opacity or visibility. So for example, I'll start off And just to illustrate my point, right? I started off with a grid, but I can easily replace that with, let's say, a sphere. And notice now that I have something totally different. Okay? Now, that's a sphere, but let's say I can use a test geometry and let's say a pig head, and then I'll add that in. See, I'll have something totally different as well. Okay? So again, I'm just showing you guys that it's non-destructive. Try doing this in Houdini and in Maya, it doesn't work. Okay? Okay, that's right. Good question from Samuel. Can you use the same? Yes, you can. Okay, and we'll cover that as we move along. So what we can do is we can map the position, the y position of the points to the color, and we can. So let me just, I guess, show you guys that. Okay, so for example, you have that one. You know what? It's a bit tricky because we have to isolate the components. So we'll just have a look at that later on. Okay, but let's just have a look at other attributes that you can manipulate. So maybe I'll change this to, let's say, 80 and 80. Okay, so just another example, what you can do with the grid. Alpha is something you can manipulate. Alpha is an attribute that Houdini understands. Guys, there are some attributes that Houdini understands. There are some attributes that you can create and then tell Houdini how to read it. Okay, it is possible. But alpha is something Houdini understands. And let me just show you what it looks like. Okay, so there is something called attribute adjust float. And so let's look for that. So attribute adjust float. So there we go. Okay. So attribute adjust float, and I'll plug that in. I mentioned this is p scale. Houdini understands p scale, but it's a bit tricky. We'll talk about that later on. But I already mentioned that there is an attribute Houdini understands, and it's alpha with a capital A, alpha, like that. Okay, so capital A, L, P, H, A. Okay. And again, it's something that Houdini understands. Okay. Now, notice that currently you're not seeing anything. It's basically assigning an alpha of 0. So basically what this means, guys, is this alpha, if it's 0, it's invisible. If it's 1, it's visible. Just to prove my point, constant value is currently 1, 0, so we don't see anything. We're seeing the lines, but it's technically nothing, guys. If you go back here, see, it looks like you're seeing it, but you're not, right? The only reason why we're seeing it is I have smooth wireframe turned on there, but see, there's nothing there. Okay, so I'll just put it back. Again, there's nothing there, right? You just have to trust me. The only reason why you're seeing something there is because we have smooth wireframe turned on as a way to visualize it. But you know what? I'll just turn it off. Okay, so there's nothing there. Okay, and that's because for all of the points there, their alpha is 0, meaning they're invisible. But if you change that to 1, okay, so see, constant value set to 1. Notice what happens. Now they're visible. In fact, let me just add a color, attribute adjust color, so you can really see. And maybe I'll just add a noise. Okay, there you go. Okay, there you go. Maybe this is confusing. So you know what? I'll just do this for now. Okay, constant value of 1. There you go. So again, if it's 0, you won't see anything, but if it's 1, you do see something. Now, the great thing about that is, yes, you can actually use a noise pattern there as well. So see, notice what happens there? With the noise pattern, if I hit play, it's not animated, sorry. But see, some of it is visible, purely visible. Some of this is opaque. And what I can do, guys, is I can remap that. So what's happening is it's using position. And basically, it's assigning some points an attribute alpha of 0, and some of it it's assigning an attribute alpha of 1, and it's also assigning it anywhere in between. So you can actually see that there, right? There you go. Okay, so what we can do is we can just remap that, meaning I really just want to hide or zero out most of it. So see, guys, I'm zeroing out most of it, and I'm just making sure that the higher values there will have, full opacity. So what happens is, if you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet, see, it's either 0 or 1. Okay, that's because I did it here, right? So I made it, most of them to be 0, some of them to be 1. And notice what happens now. If I hit play, under animation, animate noise, I have something like that. Okay, so what's essentially is happening is we're animating the alpha. We're using a noise function to animate the alpha or the visibility of those points. That's why we're getting something like this. And if I just go back here, see, we're seeing something like that because we're animating the alpha of those individual points. And alpha is basically opacity. Okay, not really opacity, it's visibility of those points. Does this make sense, guys? So what we're able to do, right? We're just covering three simple things first. We can manipulate color, we can manipulate position, and we can manipulate alpha. Alpha is a float, meaning it only has one value. So see? So alpha is just either, so it's not a vector, right? So color, for example, has a red component, a green component, and a blue component. Position has X, Y, and Z, but alpha is basically just one component, okay? So is everything making sense so far in terms of what we're doing, okay? Now, if you remove the color, then you obviously just end up getting something like that, okay? So notice now that I am getting something like this. So maybe one last, guys, okay? So as I mentioned, you can definitely, combine all of that if you want to. Let's see. So maybe we'll just cover that later on the process. But you can definitely combine that. So for example, we have alpha there. You can add things like, a mountain node on top of that. Or you can put it after. So there's a mountain node there. And then there you go. And then maybe on top of that, we add a color. Sorry, not color, attribute adjust color, right? Adjust color. So attribute adjust color. So there's attribute adjust float and there's attribute adjust color. And then we'll just make this, you know what, I'll try radial, for example. So radial, that's right. So it does look like a heat map. So notice that we have radial here. Let's see if this works. And position. Oops. So let's see. 10 or 1. There you go. Or maybe 2. Okay. There you go. Jeez. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, right? But what I'm doing is I'm just adding the color in, and then we're doing the alpha thing, and then we're adding a mountain node on top of that. And notice what happens. We have something like this. Okay. So yes, we can animate the mountain node on top of that. So I'll just go animation and then activate that. So there you go. So I have something interesting already. Okay. Okay, so one last thing, okay? And that's extrusion, because you can actually apply this to anything, okay? So let me just show you what I mean, okay? So with that grid, and let me just turn on my wireframe because so you can really see the individual faces. And what I'll do is I'll just change this to, let's say, 20, 16, and 16. Okay, there you go. Now, with that grid, guys, and just to show you, right? Because you can apply this to any type of attribute. Now, if you, for example, create a node that modifies, let's say, an object, that node might allow you to access attributes on a point or face basis. And let me just show you an example of that. So, for example, something like extrude, poly extrude, for example, okay? Poly extrude allows you to extrude faces, all of those faces. So see, I can increase the distance. So notice what happens there. I can just extrude all of those faces, okay? So that's what they're doing. The poly extrude allows you to extrude all of those faces. If you want to extrude them individually, what we can do is we can change this to individual elements. You don't really see the difference, but see, the moment I press inset, I'm able to extrude it like that, okay? So again, if you have this as connected, basically you can't really do that. It just treats it as one mesh. But if you do it with individual elements, you're able to do something like that. Okay, you can increase the number of divisions. So you're able to have more points in between those extrusions, and then you can even twist it around if you want to. Okay, but that's not necessarily the thing that's interesting for me. Okay, the thing that's interesting for me is that most nodes inside Houdini have additional local controls. So just to show you, this poly extrude, guys, if you have a look at local control, it actually allows you to specify or use an attribute called Z scale to manipulate the extrusion. Okay? So what this means is if you have an attribute called Z scale, it can control the extrusions on a per point or per face basis. Okay? So again, what does this mean? This means that if you're activating this or using Z scale, you can use an attribute to manipulate the individual extrusions of the faces there. So everything is the same currently, but if you have a Z scale attribute, you can use that to manipulate the extrusions on a per face basis. So I just need that attribute created somewhere here, just to prove my point. I'm going to create an attribute, okay? It's called attribute create. You don't even have to, but I'm just showing you, right? So I'm going to create an attribute create. I'm going to name this attribute. Remember, guys, it has to be named Z scale. So I'm going to call that Z scale. Okay? And then I'm going to make this a primitive attribute. Okay? So see, it's a primitive attribute, meaning it's an attribute for the faces, right? It's not a point attribute. It's a primitive attribute for the individual faces. Okay? Now, what does this mean, guys? If you have a look at the geometry spreadsheet, it's a primitive attribute. Currently, we're seeing only the points. But if you have a look, notice that we can see the primitive attributes now. So if I activate that, see, every one of those faces will have a 0 Z scale. Just to prove my point, if I go to my scene, I can activate those individual faces. So display primitive numbers. So maybe here. So see, guys, every single one of those faces, so face 0, for example. So phase 0, I'm looking for it. Jeez. There it is. Jeez. Okay, so there you go. That's phase 0. Phase 0 has a Z scale attribute. So here, it has a Z scale attribute of 0. Okay? That's why if you have a look at the poly extrude, notice that it's not really giving you any extrusion because it has 0 extrusion. But what if we actually change that? We change this value to, let's say, 1. Okay? So we're manipulating just the first value. Okay? Maybe let's try 5. There you go. Jeez. So for example, if I change this to, let's say, 1, guys, okay, and I activate this, notice what happens. It's pushing everything to 1, meaning every Z scale attribute here for the faces will have a Z scale attribute of 1, meaning they will all have the same distance scale. They all have the same extrusion, okay, because they're all the same. But what if we manipulate that, okay? What if we change that Z scale by adding a simple attribute adjust noise or attribute adjust float, similar to what we did with alpha. So remember, we have an attribute adjust float, okay? And for that attribute adjust float, guys, I'm going to target Z scale. And remember, it's a primitive attribute, okay? So notice what happens now, okay? So let's see. There you go. So we're going to target that. We're using constant, but what if we add something like a noise parameter there? Okay, so see, instead of using constant, we're using now a noise parameter. So some of them will have, let's say, 1.6, some of them will have 1.9, some of them will have, different values there. Let's see what happens now. If you have a look at the poly extrude, notice what happens, guys. Some of them will have a particular extrusion. Some of them will have, everyone will have a different type of extrusion, right? So notice that I can even animate that. Meaning I'll change this to, let's say, animation, animate noise, and then I'll just hit play. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so notice what happens. I'm able to, so what's happening is, guys, we're just adding an animated noise that's manipulating the Z scale attribute. Okay, the Z scale attribute is animated now. It's being deformed. It's being modified by this attribute adjust float. And now, because it's changing, it's also changing the extrusion of our faces. Okay, because the reason why it's changing is because we activated the local scale distance scale, and it's using the z-scale parameter or z-scale attribute to control the amount of extrusion it's getting. In fact, if you turn this off, notice what happens. Nothing happens. But if you activate that, notice now that we have that. Okay, as I mentioned, you don't even need that attribute create. Okay, if you just know that you're manipulating z-scale, see, notice that again, z-scale is a primitive attribute and we're able to manipulate it. Okay, so now I have something like this. Okay, so does this make sense, guys? I'll do it one more time, right? So again, the idea behind it is we're just creating a poly extrude. Okay, and the poly extrude, if you just do it individually, you're able to create distances and then you're able to inset that, and it's just manipulating every single face separately, right? But the thing is, you can activate local control. And what this means is if you have an attribute called z-scale, and that attribute is for the faces of our or individual faces of our grid, you can use that attribute to control the amount of extrusion each one of those faces is getting. So what I can do is I can add a simple attribute adjust color. So attribute adjust attribute adjust float, sorry. And that attribute adjust float is controlling Z scale. But it's not going to be a point class where the Z scale is a primitive class, meaning it's manipulating the primitives. So that's why I changed it to primitives. And then doesn't really matter with a constant value. I'll just change it to, let's say, noise. And then notice what happens there. I'll just activate animation and it animates. Now I can play around instead of using add. Maybe I'll use, I don't know, uh, maybe I'll increase the max value and the minimum value. And maybe I'll set in always. And then maybe instead of using simplex, I'll try, I don't know, Perlin, for example. Okay, so now I have something like that. Yes, technically you can add audio there as well. Okay, but we'll have a look at that later on in the process. Okay, so does this make sense for everyone? Does it is it clear that attributes, controlling those attributes allow you to create some really interesting effects? Okay, so what we're doing here is just controlling those attributes, right? So we controlled things like color, we controlled things like position, we controlled things like Z scale, which is for the extrusion, and we also controlled what was that? Alpha. Okay. Now this is just just the tip of the iceberg. There's lots of attributes. You can even create your own attributes. But for now, we're manipulating just those four simple things. Okay. With that said, can you guys just grab a quick 2-minute break or 3-minute break, and then we'll have a look at the next thing that's important, and that's grouping. Okay, so once we covered grouping, we should have everything we need. We'll just have a look at rendering, and then we have everything we need to be able to create our first challenge. Okay, but for now, quick 2 minutes, and then we'll be back, and then we'll talk about a few things. Okay. If you guys are ready to continue, um, so just a quick thumbs up if you guys are good to go. We'll have a look at a few things, just grouping and maybe a few other things. Great. Okay, we'll probably just start, right? So at this stage, you guys might be familiar or are familiar with the concept of attribute manipulation. So we can manipulate attributes, and that allows us to create some really interesting color effects, position effects, and all of that stuff. Alpha and extrusions and stuff like that, right? Let's have a look at another really important thing, and that's grouping. Okay, so let me just quickly show you what I mean. So I'm going to just hide this, and maybe again I'll just use a grid, and I'll just go grouping example. So I just created a new object there. You can disregard that, but just concentrate on this new object. How I'm doing it here, guys, I'm using the object level. It's like your perspective view, meaning your middle mouse drag, and you're basically panning, and then middle mouse, I think it's the mouse, or you can use Alt and right mouse button, and you can dolly in and out, and then you can just, or press F to frame that particular object. So maybe there. Okay. So guys, what I'll do is I'm going to increase the number of points on this object. So maybe a few. So maybe 20 and 20. It doesn't really matter. So let's just have a quick look. Okay. Because what you can do is you can group things together as well. Or group points, group faces, or group components. So I have a grid there. Okay. So what I'll do, guys, is let's say I want to group, let's say, uh, maybe I'll group. So again, what I'll do is I'll press tab and I'll go for group. Okay, I'll look for group, then I'll just connect that. Now, from a logical perspective, basically what's happening is we start with a grid and we just create a group for that. The group is currently set to primitives, meaning we're creating a primitive group, meaning a group of faces. When I say primitives, it's basically faces. When it's points, it's basically those individual points. You can disregard edges and vertices for now. We're primarily using primitives and points. So I'll just use primitives. Okay, I'll just call this group. Doesn't really matter. My group, for example, my GRP. Okay, so how do you assign objects to the group? The easiest way is to activate or make sure that's visible, and then just click on this button, and that allows you to select the faces that you want to be part of the group. So click on this, and then you start selecting the faces. Meaning, I'll select this face, I'll hold the shift key to select those face, maybe those face, and maybe, I don't know, those faces there. Okay, so once you select those faces, just press enter, and it allows you to add those faces in. It looks like I might have, there you go. So again, guys, I'll do it one more time, right? So group, there's a lot of ways to group stuff. Activate that, and then we specify what part of the group. So I'll just select that, shift select, and then once you're done, press enter, and it allows you to select those groups there. Okay. So why are groups important? Because you can access those groups anytime you want. So let me just change this, my GRP. So just an example for that, guys. Okay. I can go select that. I can, with that group created, I can, for example, go and use a blast node. Okay, so blast, and I'll collect that. So basically what the blast node does, it deletes things. Okay, so if I activate that, it deletes everything. But notice that I can actually just specify what I want to delete. Let's say I only want to delete the stuff inside my groups. And notice what happens, it only deletes or blasts the faces that I specified in my group here. In fact, I can even press this, delete non-selected, and notice that it deletes everything except the things inside my group. Okay, now this sounds straightforward, but there's a lot of ways you can generate groups. But let me just show you what you can do with groups. Other things you can do with groups is, for example, I can add an attribute adjust color and maybe give it a green color, and then I'll connect that. And notice what happens. I can just assign that attribute adjust color only on group that I created, my group. And see, notice what happens. I have something like that. Okay, so I have green on just, I'll make this faces or primitives, and notice what happens. I have something like that. Okay, now just to prove my point, it can even work with, let's say, poly extrude and almost any type of uh, application, guys. So for example, poly extrude, right? If I just want to extrude just those faces, see my group, and then I'll increase that, and then maybe I'll just do an inset. There you go. Okay, so we're able to create that part. So again, we're able to create a group, and then a lot of the nodes inside Houdini can be specified to specific groups. So we can extrude just objects in a group, you can manipulate just objects in the group, and you can do a lot of stuff with it. Now, is the idea of groups clear for everyone? What that group allows you to do? So just checking with Ariel all the way to Zachary. So it's important, right? So as long as you understand, the tricky bit is to generate how to generate the groups. So selecting it is one easy thing. Now, the reason why grouping is important is because you can procedurally create groups. So what do I mean by procedurally create groups? I'll go for group. Okay? I'll activate that. I'll connect that. So yes, you can select the group here, okay? But notice that you can actually generate or create a bounding box that allows you to specify the area where you want to, or a region where you want the faces to be, part of a group. So you can create a region where everything inside it will be part of that group. So if I enable that, notice what happens. It's set to bounding box. I'll just change it to sphere. And then I can increase the size of that. Okay. So what I'll do, guys, I'll see that group. I'm selecting that and I'm clicking this that allows us to manipulate that object. So what this does is if you click on this manipulator, it just allows you to make it bigger. It modifies the center and the size. So just to show you, you can manipulate it directly here by middle mouse dragging. See? Or this one by middle mouse dragging. But if you activate the manipulator, you can do it here. I'm holding the shift key and I can just make it bigger. And I'm holding the shift key, I can make that bigger. Okay. So what is it doing, guys? Anything inside that bounding box is now part of that group. So again, anything inside that bounding box is part of the group. Okay. So what does this mean? This means is for if you do things like blast, right? And you blast that particular group, it's called group 1. Notice what happens? You're just blasting whatever inside that bounding box. Now, the great thing about that is that's totally animatable as well. So how do you animate things inside Houdini? I'll go to frame 1. What I'll do, guys, is I'll keyframe. So maybe I'll make this smaller first. I'm holding the shift key and I'll click on one of the corners there. Again, making sure that manipulator is turned on. And then I'll just activate it. Or you can manually change the options there. So I'll make that smaller. And then there you go. Okay. So how do you keyframe stuff? You keyframe stuff by first, similar to Maya, you specify the frame, the starting frame first. And then what you do is you press Alt. I'm not sure what, I think it's Option in Mac, but Alt. Alt left mouse click, I'll click on the size. Notice it turns green. That means it has a keyframe in it. I'll also keyframe center. So middle mouse, Alt, left mouse click, and then center. Okay. What's happening is you're telling Houdini that at frame 1, you're keyframing size and center. I'll go to, let's say, frame 120. And maybe I'll just change this to 120. There's a number of frames. And then I'll change this, okay? So make this bigger, holding the shift key, and then make this bigger. There you go. Okay? So, and then I need to keyframe it again. To keyframe it, you can press this button now. If you created a keyframe, it will if pressing this button automatically creates additional keyframes for that. Or I prefer just pressing Alt, left mouse button click, Alt, left mouse button click on the name of the attribute. Okay, so let's see if that works. Okay, if I hit play, notice what happens. Looks like, there you go. It is increasing. Okay, so the reason from a logical perspective, what's happening? What's happening is we start with a grid and then we group things together. We're using the bounding box to control what's inside the group. Okay, so we animated that bounding box and we just blasted whatever's inside that group. In fact, I can make that delete non-selected and it does the opposite thing. So see, notice now that I have something like that. Okay, so again, a procedural way of creating a group, right? So instead of specifying it manually, I'm using a bounding box and animating that bounding box going outwards. Okay. Now, the great thing about that, guys, is with groups. Now, with groups, similar thing. The groups can be primitives, but it can also be points. So see, so what I'm doing is I'm just deleting the points. So notice now that does exactly the same thing. Or not exactly, but, similar stuff. Anyway, this is just one way of creating procedural groups. I'll just show you another way of creating procedural groups, right? You can actually create a procedural group based off, there's a lot of ways to do it. I'll just show you, you can create group by range, okay? So let me just show you what group by range does, okay? So group by range allows you to specify or create some rules with regards to how faces are selected or grouped in that particular group. So for example, you can select 1 out of every 2 and notice what happens. You're now selecting every other face. So see, 1 out of 2, and you're selecting every other face. 1 out of 3, and you're selecting every third face. Okay, so first you select, then you skip the next two, and then you select the next one. Or you can just change that anywhere you want. Okay, and you can also play things, or this also has offset, which allows you to just do things like that. Okay, so what this means, guys, is, see, we're calling it group 1. I can do exactly the same thing. So see, notice now I'm able to delete every other, not really delete, but delete uh, 2 faces for every 1 face that I have created that particular effect. Okay, so notice now that I can even animate this. In fact, I'll animate the offset. So maybe at uh, frame 1, offset is 0. But if I go to, let's say, frame 120, offset, I don't know, is maybe 20. Okay, and then keyframe that. And let's see what that looks like. If I hit play, I get something like that. Okay, now combine this with, let's say, extrusion, poly extrude, and then you have something like, I guess, there you go. Then you have something like this. Okay. So again, there's just a lot of ways you can create groups, right? You can create groups you can even create groups based off attributes. I'll just cover that next week. But see, you're able to create some really interesting effects there. Okay. So is this clear for everyone? So again, there's a lot of ways you can create groups. There's procedural ways. The reason why grouping is important is because there's a lot of things you can do with grouping, right? You can modify specific objects. You can procedurally create groups and then adjust it. And then there's a lot of things you can do on top of that. Okay, so is this making sense for everyone here? Just checking if that's clear. Any questions? Grouping is clear for everyone, so we're able to group things. Again, guys, we're using primitives, but that can easily be points, that can easily be other things. So select every other primitive. Basically, I use this group by range, and basically what I'm doing is I'm selecting under range filter. So basically, it's group range. So group range, group by range. We're selecting faces, but that could have been easily points. And then we just select 1 out of, I don't know, 2, for example, right? You can't see it, but if you activate points though, then I think you should be able to see it. But regardless, what I'll do is I'll just use a blast node. And I'll just blast everything inside that group. I'll click on this one. There you go. And then you can even animate that if you want. Okay. So we'll cover grouping more later on in the process, but last topic for today. So again, grouping, you can assign color, you can transform them, you can blast it, you can extrude, you can manipulate, you can add materials and stuff like that. Okay. So one last thing, let's just have a look at basic rendering at this stage. Okay. So just to demonstrate this, let me just maybe activate this. Maybe I'll just add a color. And maybe set this to noise, and then maybe set this to primitives. Okay, and then let's see what that looks like. Okay, there you go. And the great thing about this, guys, is this is non-destructive, so I can still manipulate this and then maybe make this longer and then maybe modify that. There you go. Okay, so I have something like that. Okay, so just basic rendering, right? So it's not going to be advanced rendering, just basic rendering. Basically, it's hardware rendering. So how do you render stuff in your Houdini? Okay, so very basic way of doing this is to just make sure that you have all of those things that's specified here. So to be able to create any 3D rendering in any software, you need a 3D mesh. Okay, so we do have that 3D mesh there, guys. I'm going back to object level because I am basically rendering this one out. So relatively straightforward stuff, right? We need a mesh. We have that mesh already, okay? We need the camera. So what I'll do is I'll just create a camera, and you can access that by going lights camera here. So notice that you can create a lighted camera. Again, preferably you want to use build. So with that lighted camera, guys, what I'll do is I'll left mouse button drag that directly to my object level. Okay? Or you can click on it if you want. You can click on it and notice that it automatically creates a camera for you. Now, the tricky part with the camera is you have to lock it to be able to move it. Okay, so what do I mean by that? If you just move or rotate your camera, I'm viewing my camera by just going here, changing that to camera, and I can just move that and rotate. The problem is the moment you do that, guys, see, the camera didn't actually move. Okay, so the camera is still there. Okay, so do that one more time, right? So see, camera, I'm viewing the camera, and then if I want to change the view or rotate the view, I'll press Alt and left mouse button drag, similar to what you do in Maya. The problem is, see, the camera didn't actually move. So what you need to do with cameras is you need to lock it, which is this one. Lock it. Once it's locked or once it's red, then you can reposition that maybe anywhere you want. So maybe, something like that. Okay, so maybe, you know what, I'll just do, I guess, something like this. Okay, there you go. Okay, so lock your camera. We have the geometry, we have the camera. Okay, so again, 3D mesh, 3D camera. We just need a light. Okay, so we need the third thing, right? And that's a light. So how do you create lights? Similar to what you have here. You have point light, spotlight, area light. Let me just create, the easiest ways to do this is using an area light. So I'll just plug in an area light and then reposition that area light after. So what I'll do, guys, is I'll just turn off, because I like my camera view now, I'll just turn off lock so I can just go back to my perspective view. So this is my light, guys. I'll just reposition that light, maybe reposition that there. I'll rotate that light. Okay, and with that light, maybe I'll just increase the exposure or the intensity and perhaps the exposure a little bit. Okay, maybe change the color. Again, we're looking at the properties of the light, right? And then maybe I'll just reposition this somewhere there. Okay, I'll just create another light. So maybe I'll create another area light. I'm dragging it and then repositioning it afterwards. So to reposition it, press T or just use the move tool, the rotate and the scale. So it's T, R, and E. And then I'll just reposition that maybe somewhere here, maybe rotate that a little bit, and then change that color to, let's say, blue. And maybe increase the exposure a little bit. So maybe something like that. Okay. So we're almost done, guys. Just a few more things. We have a mesh, we have a camera, and we have a light. But the problem with the light is it doesn't have any shadows. So what I want you to do, guys, is see, if you haven't, currently it's set to normal lighting. You want to turn on shadows by just going under high quality lighting with shadows. So activate that and notice what happens. We have a little bit of shadows there. In fact, let me just increase that and maybe rotate this because the shadows are a bit too much. And maybe I'll just select this as well. You know what? Shadows are fine. So I'm happy with that. Okay, I'll look at my camera just to see what that looks like, and then I'll hit play. Okay, so there you go. So I think I like that. Okay, you can modify the shadow itself by just selecting your light, and then in the shadow, notice that you can modify the shadow intensity, and then with this light as well, you can go shadows and then modify the shadow intensity, and then we have that particular view. Okay. So again, simple stuff for now, right? We have a 3D mesh, we have a 3D camera, we have a light similar to what you do in Maya. You can modify the light and all of that stuff. And I think that's it, guys. We can assign a material. So maybe I'll just show you how to assign a material. So basically, the easiest way to assign a material is to go under your object level. You don't really have to. Um, you know what? We can just skip the materials for now. We'll cover that next week. But we're really ready to render at this stage. So how do you render out your sequence? How do you render out this one? Okay, what I'll do, maybe I'll change the background first. I'll go under Open Displays Options. I'm going to go under Background, and I'll just make this dark. Okay, so I prefer a dark background. Um, let's have a look at a few other things. I think that should be fine. Scene. We can improve the lighting as well, but you know what? That should be fine in terms of what we're doing. So just changing the background to black is fine. So ready to render out, guys. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to create a flipbook, and the flipbook allows you to render what your camera sees, or basically what you're seeing here. So if, for example, you have lights, you can see the lights visibly there. I can just turn that off. It doesn't really affect the lighting. It just turns off the display of it in your perspective view. So I like that. Okay, so see, I like this. Okay, so it goes from 1 to 120. So what I'll do, guys, I'm going to render it out. And the way to render it out is to create a flipbook right around here. Okay, so click flipbook. Sorry, this one, this first one, render flipbook. Click on this. It allows you to change the settings of that flipbook. And basically what will happen, guys, is it asks you what your frame range is. So my frame range is frame 1 to frame 120. Where will I save it? Okay, I'll save it in my folder. Remember, we have a project folder. We have the test project folder. You can actually access it using jobs. And that's going to be, maybe I'll plug that under render. And then maybe I'll create a new folder there, or you don't even have to. I'll just use that folder, accept, and give it a name. So this is the tricky bit, guys. This is, let's say, my anim. I'll give it a name. My anim. Okay? Now, the tricky bit here is you have to tell Houdini that you're rendering every single frame, right? And the way to do that is to use a function called $F. And $F allows you to render every single frame. So basically, that's the frame that you want to render. So it renders frame 1, frame 2, frame 3. Guys, it has to be $F. Otherwise, it won't work. Okay? So you have to have $F. But sometimes you want to put a value afterwards. That allows you to create padding. And basically what this means is it will render. So if you have a padding of 3 or a value of 3 there, what will happen is it will render, it will give it a file name of frame 001, 002. So it just uses 3 digits, right? 003, 004. So it has 3 digits when it's creating those files for you. And lastly, what you need to put, guys, is the file extension. And for you, I'll just recommend .jpeg, .jpg, or JPEG. Okay, so JPG, .jpeg, and that's it. Okay, so I'll just put that in the chat. So see, the $F is important, the padding is important as well, and then the file extension .jpeg is important. I'll hit accept. And all I'll do, guys, is press the start button, and it will start rendering what's visible in your screen here. So start, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so notice that it will open mplay. So see, it will open mplay, and it's basically rendering every single frame. Okay, basically it's rendering everything that's visible in your screen there. Okay, and just to prove my point, if you created a project folder, which I assume that you guys should do, right? It's something you need to do. So test projects, remember, render. See, guys, that's frame my anim 001, 002, 003, 004, all the way to 120. Okay, so it is an image sequence. Okay, now what you can do afterwards is you can just convert that image sequence into a movie file. And the way to do that is I'll just use a special application in Adobe called Media Encoder. So if I just look for Adobe Media Encoder, lots of ways you can do this. You can even do it here in mplay. You can file export it, I think, save sequence as. but I don't really recommend you do that. Just go Adobe Media Encoder, everyone. Anyone familiar with Media Encoder here? So just quickly checking. You can use Premiere, After Effects, but Media Encoder is easy. Okay. So Media Encoder, all you need to do is double click under Q, look for that particular image sequence. Not sure where it is. There you go. Test project. Remember, it's render. I'll select one. It's a JPEG sequence, so I just need to select one, and it just automatically imports the JPEG sequence for me. What you might want to do sometimes, see, this should work already, but what you might want to do is you might want to just change the name. So see, it's going to render it in my, I'll put it in my desktop, and I'll just call this my anim. Okay, it's an MP4 file. That's fine. What I like doing is sometimes it's automatically changing it to 30 frames per second. So see guys, it's 2997. That's, I'm actually animating at 24, so I'll just change that to 24. Okay, so again, what I did was I just clicked on this button here, this match source, and then change that frame rate to 24. And that's it. Hit OK, and then hit play. So it just puts it in the queue. What happens is now it's an MP4 file. And just to prove my point, the MP4 file is this one. See, I'm playing it in Media Player. See, that's my file. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just put that here. Okay, week 1 challenge, and I'll put PGW example. Okay, okay, and then I'll just drag that file, my anim, here. Okay, so there you go. So it's an MP4 file, guys. Okay, so you won't be able to, if it's 120 frames, you can't just plug in 120 frames in Discord. It doesn't work. But if it's MP4, notice that you are able to do that. Guys, that's not the challenge, right? The challenge is this one. Okay, see if you're able to do that. Okay, again, try doing the color, try doing the effect where it's actually appearing, right? So this is just an example, really. I'm showing you that you're able to just export, create a movie file, image sequence, put that in Adobe Media Encoder, and then plug that into as a submission. Okay. So is that relatively clear? Everything is recorded anyway, so you can have a look at the recordings, and then follow along if I'm going too fast. But is this clear for everyone? Just checking. So checking with, I guess, Zachary, Samuel, Prasan, Olivia, Keith, Jared, Jake, Isabel, Danny, Blake, and Ariel. Okay, so this is the challenge for this week, guys. I'll take it a step further. Okay. Um, you know what? Earn up to 10 points. I'll just leave it there. Okay. You know what? I'll make it full 10 points. So you get the full 10 points if you finish this by I don't know, Sunday. Okay. So there you go. Okay. So do that. Okay. You're recreating this particular shot. Okay. So looking forward to seeing your stuff. I'm going to stop the recording at this stage. And again, have a look at my announcements and have a look at the challenge. See if you're able to do this. Relatively simple, but let's see what you guys come up with. Okay. And I'll stop the recording here as well.